Welcome to another event in the UCLA Getty Conservation Program's Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm Glenn Wharton, Chair of the UCLA Getty Interdepartmental Program in the Conservation of Cultural Heritage. UCLA is a land-grant institution, and the UCLA Getty program acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples in the traditional land caretakers of the Tovan Gar, the Los Angeles Basin, and the South Channel Islands. In this series, we invite leaders in allied fields to reflect on larger issues of cultural heritage conservation, which span from technical research and intervention on cultural heritage materials to larger concerns such as authorship, authenticity, illicit trade, and repatriation. And today's lecture addresses all of these issues. I'm pleased to say that for the first time, we're co-hosting the event with the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture. Following the lecture, we'll conduct a discussion with our speaker. Unfortunately, given the large size of the audience, we won't be able to take questions. We will record the lecture and post it on our website for those who are unable to attend. I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Sharon Gerstel, Professor of Byzantine Art and Archaeology and the George P. Kolovos Family Centennial Term Chair in Hellenic Studies. Sharon is also Director of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center at UCLA. And Sharon will introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Glenn. I'm delighted to co-host with my colleague, Glenn Wharton, an event which is of technological, legal, and cultural significance. I want to signal that this event is being held under the auspices of the Consulate General of Greece in Los Angeles, and I'm very grateful to the Honorable Ioannis Stamatakos for his warm support and for being present today. We are fortunate to have with us today Roger Michel, Executive Director of the Institute for Digital Archaeology, a research consortium that has been dubbed the New Monuments Men by Newsweek magazine because of its efforts in the areas of heritage preservation and reconstruction. Working with national governments, major universities, and leading NGOs, the IDA's varied projects at sites from Sutton Hoo to Samarkand emphasize the fusion of modern digital tools and traditional archaeological techniques. Our speaker, Roger Michel, has had a very varied career. He studied at Oxford University, where his research focus was the evolution of the early English liturgy. He has worked as a government lawyer, a public prosecutor in the United States, specializing in high-profile murder cases, and as member of the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, and as an academic, as editor-in-chief of the Massachusetts Law Review, and as a longtime lecturer at Boston University Law School. And he is also a prolific author, a weekly columnist for many years for the Boston Herald, and the author or co-author of numerous scholarly articles and books on both legal and historical topics. It is this varied background that has led him to be a leading advocate in the field of heritage preservation. As founder of the IDA in 2012, he had an explicit goal stated in his own words to study, preserve, and restore ancient artifacts at a time when large numbers of irreplaceable objects are under obvious threat of being lost forever. Today, we will hear about the IDA's ongoing project concerning the Parthenon marbles, also sometimes called the Elgen marbles, contested works that have come to symbolize the national identity of democratic Greece, which has long pressed for their return to their homeland. The title of today's lecture is Phidias Unbound, How Robot-Generated Replicas Could Solve the Parthenon Marbles Quandary. Roger Michel, we welcome you to UCLA.
Thanks so much, Sharon. Thanks so much to Sharon and Glenn for giving me the chance to speak with you today about about some of our projects. We always appreciate media interest in our work, but you can't always believe everything that you read. And it's nice to have opportunities like this for direct communication to set the record straight. For example, I'm not actually a member of the Illuminati. I'm not ex-Special Forces. I'm also not Australian, which frequently gets reported. Our reconstruction of Palmyra's triumphal arch was not 3D printed, but rather carved from the same Egyptian marble as the original. It was also not designed as a gateway through which Baal could enter into our world, at least not intentionally. Much in the same way, I'd like to set the record straight today about the often misremembered history of the Elgin marbles, how they got to Britain, what happened once they arrived, and why they are still in the British Museum when virtually every other peer institution in the world has returned the Parthenon fragments to Greece. Let's start with the man himself. Let's see, get my share screen here. Here we go. Perfect. All right, so let's start with the man himself. There he is, Thomas Bruce, the 7th Earl of Elgin. Born in 1766, he dies in 1841, and he caused a huge amount of mischief in the years in between. As the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Elgin arrived in Athens in the summer of 1800. Like Beverly Hillbilly Jed Clampett, he quickly realized that there was gold in them hills, not Jed's black gold though, but here in this case, white gold, the Pentelic marble statues carved by Phidias in the 5th century BC for the Parthenon. As his many letters to friends back in England attest, Elgin quickly hatched a plan. He would chisel the sculptures from the walls of the Parthenon, cart them back to England, and sell them to his aristocratic friends to adorn their country homes. Between 1802 and 1812, approximately, the marbles were prized off the Parthenon, with a large number being irreparably smashed in the process. Unfortunately for Elgin, he overestimated demand. Nobody wanted his stolen sculptures, and his reputation suffered badly. Byron and others painted him as a reckless vandal, an image that was strongly reinforced in the popular press. Like any good salesman, Elgin turned to Madison Avenue for help, or at least the 18th century equivalent. In order to stoke up interest in his pilfered sculptures, you can't make this stuff up, he placed the marbles on display in London in a purpose-built shed alongside some of the greatest bare-knuckle boxers of the day. Guys like Gregson, Gully, and Byron's personal trainer. Yes, people had personal trainers in the 18th century, John Jackson. In addition to staging bouts, the boxers posed nude or semi-nude in front of the marbles, mimicking the poses of Phidias's creation. While crowds came, unfortunately, buyers did not. But not to be deterred from turning a profit, Elgin looked to his good friend, Viscount Castlereagh, who was Foreign Secretary at the time, for help. As newly discovered, in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, newly discovered letters reveal Castlereagh had already used his influence a few years earlier to permit Elgin to bring the marbles into London duty-free by assigning a zero value to them. Now Castlereagh supported a plan that would allow him to sell the Elgin marbles to the British government for an inflated price. While experts called by Lord Grosvenor's parliamentary committee convened for this purpose valued the badly damaged marbles at less than £10,000, Castlereagh put a figure of £35,000 on them, the number that his cronies in the House of Lords ultimately accepted. And so the marbles ended up in the BM, and they still sit there today. However, Castlereagh was made a laughingstock as a result of this in the press. In this cartoon, you see 3 starving children tugging at his coat. They exclaim, "Don't buy them, Daddy. We don't want stones. Give us bread. Give us bread." Castlereagh replies, "There's a bargain for you, Johnny. Only £35,000. The Turks gave them to our ambassador in his official capacity for little or nothing." After a few more political and personal setbacks, Castlereagh became one of the most reviled politicians in Britain and eventually committed suicide while in office. But the marbles weren't Elgin's only Athens scam. Little remembered today, he was also implicated in the theft of artworks collected by in Greece by antiquarian John Tweddle. While ambassador in Athens, Elgin seized Tweddle's valuable collection of paintings, drawings, and journals after his death. His heirs brought legal action against Elgin, settling the case out of court after Elgin returned most of the stolen items. Elgin, I have to say, was a real piece of work, and he's hardly the Good Samaritan or cultural heritage hero he's often made out to be. Okay, so what happens when the marbles got to the British Museum? While Elgin's original sales scheme did not come off as intended, no one could say that he was not on trend. As one historian put it, in the early 19th century, nation states collected for national prestige and to display in their public spaces trophies of war and conquest. Diplomatic battles and international culture wars were fought over antiquities. The acquisition of big antiquities, the construction of new display spaces for art, transformed the state into a classically aggrandized nation. And in 1810, the big antiquities that everybody wanted were Greek. Thanks to folks like Francis Penrose and Gödel Lessing and the great, here we have him, the great Johann Winkelmann, the father of modern archaeology, he's sometimes called, Greek art and architecture and literature were at the top of the charts. Part of the allure was the rise of republicanism connected with the revolutions in France and USA. The other part was repudiation of, I guess, what you might call Latinate flamboyance after decades of Baroque in favor of the more ascetic vibe of Greece, at least as folks like Winkelmann portray Greek aesthetics at the time. Colonial ambitions among the great powers of Europe made for rich pickings in the old world to which Britain, a country with a comparatively sparser cultural history before the year 1000 than its continental peers, aggressively aspired. Indeed, Britain, at least in relative terms, had a deep cultural void to fill, and there were men ready, willing, and able to do the job. One of the era's most successful pickers, to borrow an Antiques Roadshow term, was Charles Thomas Newton, British consul in Rome and first keeper of antiquities at the British Museum. Newton's plunder included the remains of the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, one of the 7 great wonders of the ancient world, and the monumental Lion of Cnidos. The acquisition of materia of the ancient world induced a massive transformation of British culture, both physical and intangible. Since ancient Greece had passed out of existence, Britain could assert a colorable claim to being the new standard bearer of Greek civilization, a mantle they visually reinforced through art, literature, and the built landscape. As one historian notes, disseminated through culture, highbrow and low, the Greek origins of the Parthenon sculptures were gradually erased. The marbles served as models for George III's crown. They appeared in political cartoons and plaster ceilings, moldings, wedgwood plates, you name it, postcards. A new national identity was grafted onto them and they onto it. The Romantic poets also played a significant part in that cultural colonialism. Percy Shelley, unironically, completely unironically declared in 1819, "We are all Greeks." The distant ruin of Greece became a blank canvas onto which Keats, Shelley, and Byron could project their own vision of pastoralism, offered up at least partly as an antidote to the inhumanities of the budding industrial age. In this way, ancient Greece, according to one critic, was appropriated to serve contemporary ends. The sense of infinite mutability, I guess you'd say, comes through strongly in Byron's Childe Harold. He writes, "Look on its broken arch, its ruined walls, its chambers desolate and portals foul. Yes, this was once ambition's airy hall, the dome of thought, the palace of the soul." Ultimately, however, things get out of hand. Shades of Greece could be found everywhere in Britain, from the facades of Trafalgar Square to flatware. England became every bit as much of a cargo cult as Vanuatu, with Aristophanes as their John Frum. The British landscape almost comically was littered with fanciful simulacra of the accoutrement of a vaguely understood uber race of which they stood in awe, but which they had virtually no capacity meaningfully to access. As Byron lamented elsewhere in Childe Harold, "Ancient of days, august Athena, where are thy men of might, thy grand in soul, gone glimmering through the dream of things that were?" The ease with which Hellenic culture was absorbed by Britons through the medium of the marbles was due, at least in part, to the literal ethnic cleansing of the Parthenon sculptures, rigors that included both acid washes and the liberal use of steel brushes. BM curators were well aware that the marbles had originally been brightly colored. In fact, they commissioned a study to confirm the presence of surface colors in 1834. Period paintings also made the point. However, as one anthropologist observed, the absence of color allowed for the blurring, even erasure of ethnicity, making it easier to project multiple selves onto the marbles. The ruddy browns and reds that Phidias used to depict depict Greek male skin would have diminished the possibility for largely white Britain's teleological engagement with the sculptures. To Elgin's contemporaries, the lack of color allowed the figures to seem claimable. In short, through their whitewashed appearance, the marbles were primed for absorption into the British nation, and so they were. Okay, now let's flash forward 200 years to January 28th, 2022. In fact, very little has changed over the centuries, at least as regards the Elgin marbles. The marbles still reside in the same gallery, now impossibly named after the world's most notorious art forger and the man who had recently, in the 1930s, inflicted yet another wire brush facial on the Parthenon sculptures. I'm of course referring to Lord Duveen, whose name is inscribed on the wall of the Parthenon sculptures gallery. You can't make this stuff up, and there are just so many villains floating around. You don't know where to point the finger first. The gallery has been closed for much, as of January 28th, 2022, the gallery had been closed for much of the preceding 2 years due to ceiling leaks and the resulting flooding. BM trustee and avant-garde ceramicist Grayson Perry is churning out large-scale amphori plaster with anachronistic iconography. We're right back in the 1820s and 1830s, with Wedgwood doing the same. And the BM is still just as firm as it was in 1822 in its resolve to retain the marbles. Beyond that, and even more important, the culture of antiquity is still front and center 200 years on. As one social commentator put it, that modern civilization considers many of its greatest achievements to be refinements of classical culture is evident in the markers of historical continuity that surround us still. The architecture of educational and governmental institutions, the language of medicine, the use of myths like Oedipus through which we explain ourselves, reverence for Greek accomplishment is so embedded in our current experience that we might easily forget that the idea of Greece as the birthplace of civilization, at least for Britain, is really only about 200 years old. Okay, so carrying all of that heavy baggage, Greek Ambassador Replicas and I appeared together at Keats' house in London on January 28th, strangely warm night, with Poet Laureate Simon Armitage in tow, to mark the 200th anniversary of the death of John Keats. After discussion with Mr. Replicas, I announced the IDA's plan. There's the ambassador speaking, wonderful guy. I announced the IDA's plan to reconstruct the Parthenon sculptures rendered in the original Pentelic marble with a degree of accuracy that will significantly exceed the limits of human visual acuity. That is to say, they will be exact visual duplicates. We proposed beginning with 2 proof of concept objects, the Selene horse and a metopede depicting the Centauromache. Okay, so we make the announcement. The next day, the Telegraph runs a long, very favorable article on the project. The story immediately gets picked up by all of the national dailies in the UK and many in Greece. Long strategy sessions ensue at the Greek embassy and among various other groups of stakeholders. Then, a couple weeks later, February 14th, the Times, after 2 centuries of opposition to repatriation, runs both a full-page story on our project, together with a 500-word lead editorial strongly endorsing our reconstruction project as a likely and reasonable solution to the Elgin dispute. In particular, the Times points out how these very special copies will allow the British Museum to fully discharge its avowed public mission, that is to teach people about the art of ancient Greece. The Guardian follows suit, the story goes viral, and it appears in papers all around the world. Over the summer, on the same day as the Webb telescope images are reported, the New York Times runs a 2-page, 2,000-word front-page story in the Science Times section. The Webb story is in a little box down there on the lower right. The Washington Post then follows suit with its own full-page story, the front page of the World section. The BBC World Service and multiple TV networks likewise air stories. The project is favorably debated in the House of Lords. Poll numbers swing wildly on the back of this massive coverage, with 80% of Britons suddenly favoring repatriation. 80% is a huge number. I'm here in Massachusetts. I can tell you Ted Kennedy never won the Senate race by 80%. It's a huge number for a poll. The Greeks and British then suddenly are talking about the possibility of talks and conciliation. George Osborne, whom I met with over the summer, announced there's a deal to be done with the marbles. Throughout the summer into September, momentum continues to build, stalled just a little bit now by the UK government's transition, and of course, the sad death of Queen Elizabeth. helping to move things along, and the stories just go on and on and on. But helping to move things along, the Time prints an op-ed piece that I wrote identifying a loophole in the British Museum Act of 1963 that creates a mechanism for the BM trustees to return the marbles through unilateral action, contradicting decades of assertions by the BM. This is the excuse they use all the time, that only an act of parliament would permit them to repatriate the marbles. A few weeks later, the Charities Commission clarifies its own regulations, that in fact such unilateral action is fully authorized. The stage is now set. All that remains is for Mr. Osborne and the Greek Prime Ministers to select a mutually opportune moment to announce a deal. Okay, so why has our project helped to break this 200-year-old logjam? And the answer has multiple parts. In the first place, it is clearly a product of current events and zeitgeist. Many museums are in the process of repatriating massive numbers of objects globally, including marquee items like the Benin bronzes and other Parthenon fragments, Germany and Italy. The war in Ukraine has sharply increased international intolerance for traditional forms of colonial appropriation. The ancient doctrine of Oedipus has been replaced by a United Nations mandated approach that favors sovereign respect. UNESCO's surprise 2021 announcement condemning the British position on the marbles has underscored the UK's pariah status around issues of cultural appropriation. And then finally, the contrast between the beautiful state-of-the-art Acropolis Museum and the flooding issues and general decrepitude of the Duveen Gallery and the poor signage, and lack of interpretation, everything at the BM has put paid to any lingering idea that Great Russell Street might be the safer or better home for the marbles. Second, the legal landscape has changed dramatically. With numerous high-profile enforcement actions. The FBI seized a large number of objects from the Metropolitan just a few weeks ago. Over the summer, the former president of the Louvre was indicted for trafficking in looted antiquities. Investigators have been to the BM and scrutinized its Cambodian objects. These are especially problematic. Indeed, these objects have never been placed on display. I think third, our proposal has a certain kind of intuitive appeal. It will provide the BM with far better representations of the art of 5th century Greece than the Parthenon sculptures can currently. You would never try to teach people about the art of the Italian Renaissance by showing them a stack of Caravaggio's that had all of the paint missing and were otherwise battered and torn. Visitors learn nothing about the true appearance of the art of ancient Greece when they visit the BM, and we can change that. Fourth, I think that now is somehow the moment for virtuality. People are spending more time than ever during and post-pandemic leading digital lives. Mark Zuckerberg has invested billions in a new virtual platform that looks a lot like Matrix version 1. In the wake of this, our expectations of and demands for traditional forms of originality are fading. Damien Hirst spent much of this week burning his original artworks in a high-tech furnace because the majority of his customers preferred to receive NFTs. Fifth, the simple fact is, look, our robots are incredibly adorable. People are fascinated by them at both a technical and a visual level. They also evoke, I don't know, interesting resonances of the age-old struggle between John Henry and the steam drill. Fortunately, you don't have to choose with our reconstructions. They are the product of both robot labor and highly refined artistic talents from craftsmen in the Carrera workshop, operating just steps away from where Michelangelo had his own workshop. And then I guess finally, and this was certainly true of the Arch as well, people always appreciate high quality work. The duplicate marbles are produced in the same studio and by the same artist who produced marble sculptures for Hearst and for Jeff Koons. The Koons things are beyond belief. They are made from exquisite Pentelic marble, just like the originals, and a rare material, usually reserved only for repairs to Greek historic sites. They are visually stunning, and best of all, you can touch them and they feel amazing. Okay, in many ways, the trajectory of the Elgen project tracks the arc of our Palmyra Arch reconstruction. The timetable is nearly identical, a week or two to achieve international media penetration, a few weeks for government engagement, and then a few months for the first measurable public policy impacts. The Palmyra Arch project grew very accidentally out of an invited op-ed piece in the Times about possible responses to ISIS destruction of heritage objects in the Middle East. Over the course of an afternoon, a 500-word letter that I had written grew into a 3,000+ word front page cover story. It was the lead item the following day on the BBC World Earth Service and was picked up by every newspaper in the world in dozens of languages. Ends up on the cover of Newsweek, as Sharon mentioned. The idea that the destruction wrought by ISIS's sledgehammers and dynamite might be reversed in weeks rather than years created irresistible optimism in empathetic communities everywhere. Plus, the robots were just as cute in 2016 as they are now. None of this public interest would have mattered very much at all if it did not create positive social change. Within months, the reconstructed arch had drawn praise and support from government, financial, and cultural leaders around the globe. The heads of UNESCO and the IMF, here's Christine Lagarde and Irina Bokova, gathered under the arch with regional heads of state in Dubai, pledging and later providing financial support for Syrian reconstruction. Boris Johnson was our host on Trafalgar Square. A few months after this, as Foreign Secretary, he stood alone, strongly advocating for sanctions against Russia when John Kerry was urging restraint. And of course, we all know who was right in the end. I was invited to speak at the United Nations during General Assembly Week, alongside the presidents of both the Security Council and the General Assembly. And shortly afterwards, the General Assembly adopted a new protocol demanding the immediate cessation of hostilities in Syria by a vote of 122 to 13. Not much later, the Arch was invited to stand in the Piazza della Signoria in Florence at the G7 Culture Conference. We spoke to the gathered ministers alongside UNESCO, advocating for support for reconstruction of heritage objects destroyed by conflict or natural disaster. It marked a complete reversal for UNESCO, which just months earlier, during a memorable meeting in Ms. Bokova's office in Paris, had told us that they were fundamentally opposed to the concept of reconstruction. The extraordinary success of the Arch project had shifted her opinion, had shifted the opinions of the UNESCO leadership. Not long after, the UN hosted the Arch at the Place des Nations in Geneva to show its support as well. And then at the end of the year, the New York Times named the Arch, together with Christo's Floating Islands, what a sad loss when he passed away, the public art project of 2016. Early the following year, we were invited by the House Foreign Affairs Committee to install the Arch outside the US Capitol during General Assembly Week again. Significantly, the invitation came from the Republican chairman, Ed Royce, and Democratic ranking member, Eliot Engel, both longtime champions of cultural heritage. Both men spoke movingly under the Arch on the National Mall, pledging support for Syria. Then they walked back into the Capitol, and in a very short time later, the House, despite an atmosphere at the time of extreme partisanship occasioned by the very contentious Brett Kavanaugh hearings, approved a sweeping Syria aid bill co-sponsored by Royce and Engel, which passed on a voice vote. It was an astonishing example of bipartisan cooperation that one can scarcely imagine today. 5 years on, in part because of the demonstrable success of the Palmyra Arch project, reconstruction has become a respected tool for community rehabilitation in the aftermath of violence or natural disaster. UNESCO has sponsored numerous reconstruction projects in cooperation with regional governments around the world. The recent success, amazing success of the Mosul project carried out by UNESCO in partnership with our collaborators on the Arch project in Dubai is a great example of the potential for such efforts, thoughtfully executed, to improve the lives of local stakeholders. In the end, the Arch project taught us a number of important lessons. First, we learned that people are very, very good at discerning intentionality. UNESCO was initially afraid that putting our arch in Trafalgar Square would be no different than building a pyramid in Las Vegas. However, in the end, nobody was confused. Our intentions were immediately understood by local stakeholders in Syria and their allies alike. As Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said, even a dog knows the difference between getting stepped on and getting kicked, and people here understood what was happening. We also learned a lot about how people form relationships with heritage material. Although the outward focus is invariably on the public object itself, its provenance and its physical characteristics, the reality is that creating a relationship with a monument, indeed almost any artwork, is a highly personal process of projection. Such meaning as one may experience in the presence of heritage material necessarily comes from within the observer. It's not absorbed from without. Freud explored this phenomenon throughout his life, especially in Totem and Taboo, under the rubric of object relation theory. He concluded that an evocative object is one that resonates with personal and cultural significance, productive chains of association, inciting emotional responses and impelling imaginative activity. Taking this concept even further, a modern psychologist observed, we form strong embodied connections to such objects that we encounter, entering into relationships with them that permit us to express personal idiom. In doing so, we make personal use of shared cultural resources. How better to describe the mass transformation in cultural identity in Britain, inspired by the arrival of the Parthenon sculptures. This highly personal conception of object assimilation certainly accords with my own experience. My relationship with the Arch of Palmyra is derived almost exclusively from the strong personal associations that I developed over the course of the project. Without question, the most memorable installation for me was in Arona, Italy, on the banks of Lake Maggiore. We were joined at the unveiling by the sons of Khaled al-Assad, Palmyra's chief archaeologist, a wonderful guy who was murdered by ISIS for refusing to disclose the location of the city's hidden treasures, his body placed on public display by the terrorists. It was in no significant part on their behalf, that is his sons, that we undertook the Arch project in the first place. And whenever I look at the Arch, I see it through the lens of that night and that experience. To further explore the psychological experience that underlies and informs our encounters with important objects, the unveiling of our pentelic copies of the marbles will take place on November 1st, and this is the first time that we're announcing a date and a place, will take place on November 1st at the Freud Museum in London. The installation will be linked to an exhibition at the museum focusing on Freud's multiple trips to the Acropolis and his close engagement with antiquities generally. We will also host a conference at the museum on his theory of object relations and what it says about our relationship with heritage materials, including reproductions, with a special focus on totem and taboo. The Freud Museum, Freud's house, and later Anna's, is chock-a-block with Dr. Freud's vast antiquities collection, which will provide interesting context. Alongside the Pentelic horse, we will also display a new AR experience of the original Selene horse to permit good A-B comparisons. It will all be set in our virtual British Museum, which we have specially cleared of other objects for the occasion. Finally, we learned some surprising things about how people react to copies in the course of the Palmyra Arch project. Since our relationships with emotionally freighted objects are formed primarily through this process of personal projection, the physical properties of those objects can become less important. Stated differently, the literal aspect is subordinated to the anagogic. As a result, people actually have a tremendous capacity to form very powerful relationships with reconstructions. On the night of the Trafalgar Square installation, we wandered over to the Arch at about midnight to see who might be there. We found a large group of young Syrians standing under the arch and spoke with them briefly. They had come from Paris by car to see the installation that had been so much discussed in the press. They seemed pleased and happy that their home country was represented in such a conspicuous spot. One of the young women told me that she had grown up just a few miles from Palmyra, but had somehow never managed to see the city's famous triumphal arch while it still stood, even though it was just a few minutes from her home. And now she had traveled 13 hours to see our reconstruction. I asked her why. She told me that our arch, representing as it did the friendship and empathy of people far away who had no direct connection to Syria, meant infinitely more to her than the original Roman arch ever did. She said that to her, this was a powerful monument in its own right. After traveling 25,000 miles to 3 continents, having been seen by millions of visitors, and having sparked social and economic change on many fronts, it is certainly hard now not to see the arch in exactly that way. As Winckelmann himself said of copies, what is imitated, if handled with reason, may assume another nature, as it were, and become one's own. Finally, we learned in the course of the Arch project that people around the world, again, have tremendous empathy for others who have suffered through the destruction of beloved landmarks. It is a feeling to which most everyone can relate, whether it's in the context of enormous public tragedies or small personal losses. At our New York City installation, everyone from the mayor to passersby made the analogy to the terrible toll that terrorism had taken there. They had a deep intuitive understanding for the plight of the Palmyrans. In London, the analogies were to the Blitz, the scars of which are still visible on the face of that city. Our installation in Arona coincided with the earthquakes in Italy that damaged so many historic sites. So what do these lessons have to say about how best to achieve a resolution in the Elgin dispute. In the first instance, we know that we have to be crystal clear about our intentions. In some ways, this is a far more complex situation than the Arch project because we must satisfy two distinct groups of stakeholders with seemingly competing goals. In fact, we have worked hard to shift the long prevailing perception that this is a zero-sum game. That is a dispute that will necessarily produce a loser and a winner, depending on who ends up with the marbles. From the start, our consistent message has been that we can help achieve victories for both sides, a far better exhibition in the BM for the British, and repatriation of Greek sacred symbols of national sovereignty, and for both sides, an end to a long, bitter, and politically awkward dispute between longtime allies without unpleasant resort to legal process. It is important not to forget that King Charles, father, was the grandson of George I of Greece. These are countries that have been and should be friends. We also understand that we need to acknowledge the depth of Britain's connection to its adopted culture. This speaks for itself. It's on the heels of an article by Harry Mount in the Financial
Wonderful
Times.
thing, and this is, of course, very important after being in the cigar bar without cigars or Claridge's. Harry Mount writing in the Financial Times, I love this on British exceptionalism. Greece lies at the heart of two roots of British civilization, the Bible and the classical canon, the Hellenic inventions, democracy, tragedy, democracy, and comedy. History, well, they remain at the heart of British life. Ancient Athens and modern London may be millennia apart, but they share a vigorous, pulsing bloodline. We are honored to bring you today Lord Pole, Charles Lord Pole of the House of Lords, and beyond that, far more about British politics and society, and in your work at the Council on Foreign Relations and their Global Advisory Board. To put in perspective here, at the church by the Tower of London, down in the crypt, there is that old London floor. It brings back the Roman floor of ages ago. We will have in our new headquarters by Mansion House, the temple that Mike and Peter Grauer are building as well. Tell us about British exceptionalism within the London boom.
Well, I think we certainly do regard ourselves as exceptional and always have done. After all, what country of our size could have conceived of a global empire which survived hundreds of years? What country could have stood alone against Hitler's Germany, waiting for the United States to join in, but a little bit late? What country could have been the first in discovering many fields of science and so on? So we do really feel that we are exceptional.
Wow. I mean, it's hard to know what to say in the wake of that, but it does give you a very strong sense of how deep the perceived connection is, at least among some folks in Britain, and that does need to be addressed. I mean, the sense of ancient connection there is palpable, and it continues to this day. That's 4 or 5 years ago, but Britain's departing PM, Mr. Johnson, invoked Cincinnatus on his way out the door, and the guy actually looks good in a toga, much better than John Belushi ever did. So questions of national honor are implicated, questions of perceived tradition and heritage are implicated. All of those need to be addressed and catered to if a solution is to be found. And that's why we have lobbied hard for words like partnership and framing a possible resolution, the exact word that George Osborne ultimately did use. Words that acknowledge Britain's cultural stake in the disposition of these singular symbols of latter-day Hellenism. We have to get both sides comfortable to the table. It's Roger Fisher 101. We've also tried to unpack the curious history of the Greek cultural revival in 19th century England to demystify it a little bit, to help people like the folks you just saw in that video clip remember that, like received pronunciation, this infusion of Greek culture in the 19th century was a phenomenon led largely by a tiny cadre of elites. It is not essential in any way, or at least not historically so, to British culture. In short, it's time to let the marbles go, and it will actually hurt a lot less than the retained crowd might think, and that crowd is getting smaller all the time. You saw the poll numbers. Finally, based on our experience with the Arch, we have worked hard to shift the public conversation away from legal claims and focus more on moral claims. This has been a challenge. The British by nature are a rules-driven society, and so legal rules mean a lot. However, they also understand fair play better than anyone and have tremendous affection for their own national heritage. Had Prince Albert lost the crown jewels in a game of baccarat to his cousin George in the 19th century, believe me, they would have found their way home from Athens a long time ago. Invoking empathy was a huge part of our success with the Palmyra Arch project, and I think it has been and will continue to be a huge part of shifting the poll numbers in Britain. And what I'll do is I'm going to close with the words of Dr. Mahmoud Abdul Karim, our compadre with the Arch Project, and a fascinating man, a wonderful archaeologist, the Director General of Antiquities and Monuments in Syria, and no one has suffered more under the regime and professionally than he has, and yet he's stuck it out. But he captures the spirit of what we're trying to do better than I've ever heard anybody express it. The sound's not so good, but it does have subtitles.
Since many months ago, our colleague in digital archaeology for Phidias contacted us to do something for Palmyra after some destruction made by ISIS group terrorists. London is one of the biggest capital in the world. We have the human image, and we have also human responsibility. How we can save Syrian image through this war. What we do in Syria, our method is restoration. Never will rebuild new building in the ancient city. We are archaeologists, we are traditional war, but we benefit also from the technology through the 3D, through all kinds of the machining, etc. We can benefit from after 5 years as archaeologists working in Syria alone. We saved 99 collections of the museums in Syria. What we do now is international move to help us, not Syrian people, but Iraqi people in Afghanistan, Mali, Yemen, etc. When we have the terrorism, we need some help from the international. Do not leave us alone. And finally, I am sure that the peace will come in Syria, the war will finish, the crisis will finish, but all the damage on the cultural heritage in Syria will stay for generations. What we need to show to our children how the politics are different, but the cultural heritage as international community can do the best work to save cultural heritage for all generations.
So let's hope that that Greece and Britain can do exactly the same. I'll end with a quote from my favorite book, Trees Tropiques by Claude Lévi-Strauss. It's an exceedingly strange thing for a structuralist to say, but it sums up perfectly everything that I don't believe about cultural heritage, and so shares the twin virtues of being infinitely illustrative while at the same time being infinitely concise. Lévi-Strauss says, objects are what matter. Only they carry the evidence that throughout the centuries, something really happened among human beings. Let's hope that's not true. Thank you to my host here at UCLA, to the Getty Museum, to the Niarchos Foundation, to the Greek Consulate, and thanks especially to my partner, Dr. Alexei Karanovska, without whom none of this would have been possible. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wow, Roger, what a fantastic lecture. As I said at the beginning, you were going to hit it all, and I didn't know how true that would be. You basically touched on so many issues that we're concerned with in cultural heritage conservation. And it's interesting, you know, as I also said at the beginning, we invite people in from other fields to reflect on issues that we are involved in. And some of those issues are very technical, but we easily get to larger questions, many of which you addressed. So I'm tempted to just jump right into repatriation and discuss it, but I'd like to pull us back. I think we will get there, but you brought up so many other issues that we talk about all the time, such as authenticity versus, you know, the original object and replicas. You mentioned Freud and his writings on object relations, totems, taboo. I thought it was particularly interesting, the Syrian examples that you gave. So I'd like to start with a question about authenticity of the original, and to, you know, when we've got algorithms and machinery to create such high quality physical replicas, and you just touched on virtual replicas, does the original even matter anymore, or can we transition our associations or feelings to replicas. It's maybe not a well-formed question, but I'd love to hear you talk just a little bit more about originality and replicas, authenticity.
I think originality and authenticity are hugely important, but it's a question. The question is originality or authenticity. Where does it reside? When you listen to a Waltz for Debbie, let's say, you don't have to hear Bill Evans play it. You can hear somebody else play it. You don't have to hear it played on Bill Evans' piano to have the emotional impact of hearing that music. The original composition exists, and it is rendered in lots of different forms in lots of different places. And there's no particular reason why the same kind of principle shouldn't apply to plastic arts. And the reality is that the originality that's important is the originality that adheres in the brush strokes of the painter or the chisel marks of the sculptor. It's not where Picasso bought his canvas or the particular tube of paint that he used. There was no magic in that tube. I can promise you that. The magic was in his hands and was in those brushstrokes. And to the extent that those can be recreated with exact precision, we have created all that's important about the original. It may not be the same canvas or the same tube of paint, but if we can do a good enough job, and that's where quality comes into it, and that's why I emphasize that multiple times during the talk, if we can do a good enough job that the copy is perfect, that is, that we have replicated what is important about the original artwork, the artistic gestures, then absolutely we've achieved our goal, and that object, whatever it is and whatever form it consists of, that is, in my mind, something that has value and can take the place of something that we might consider to be original simply because it's made of those materials that Picasso bought on that particular day in 1951.
Well, I guess, let me push a little bit further, and then Sharon, I'm sure we both have lots of questions for Roger. Where does the magic lie then? I'm just going to push a little on this. When a robot carves a sculpture, is there any artistry, any human element involved in the artistry of these kinds of reproductions?
Yeah, I mean, the artistry of these reproductions is achingly obvious when you see these things. Number one, the robot only does about 95% of the work. And then when I say 95%, that's by weight. He removes 95% of the stone. The last 5% is done by artist of the first water in Carrara, working in the workshop again, who are producing sculptures for all of the great fine artists of the world who work in marble, and all of the finish is by hand. And so that meticulous work that brings these objects into exact alignment with the originals they are attempting to replace is done by human beings. So that's why I said it's not quite John Henry and the steam drill. It's not John Henry versus the steam drill. It's John Henry and the steam drill working together.
I want to pick up on a very important point you made, which was about the whitewashing of the sculptures and the way that we perceive them today to be beautiful white sculptures, the height of, classical beauty. But in fact, that was not the case with these sculptures. They were brown-skinned people. And my curiosity is, how did these replicas acknowledge the original appearance? And can they help us actually to envision more accurately how these sculptures actually looked to people who viewed them in their time?
Absolutely. So as we announced the project initially on January 28th, will consist of two parts. The first is the reconstruction of exact duplicates of the objects in the British Museum, with the idea being these could replace those and give the British Museum a basis for returning the originals to Greece. The second piece of it was to also provide a second set of sculptures that restore these objects to their original glory. Nobody would show an old master painting in the condition that these objects are in today. It is disrespectful to Phidias, it's disrespectful to Greece, it's disrespectful to all of the artists of antiquity. How this aesthetic developed within the world of museum conservatorship, and it's not the British Museum only by any means, that ancient objects are meant to be left as found. If a Rodin falls off the back of a truck, either you cast a new one or you repair that one. You don't put the pieces on a platform and a plinth and put them in the museum. So how this custom developed of showing antiquity in its depleted state, I do not know. I suspect that John Keats had something to do with it, but I can't be 100% sure. But the romance of the ruin has a hold on us, and we have to let it go, because what we're learning, there's two problems here. You go into the British Museum and you walk away with a complete misconception about what antiquity looked like. It was brightly colored. colored, and the color meant something, and we could talk about that in a different context. But what you also walk away with is you are participating in what has become a horrific propaganda campaign over the last 150 years by ultranationalist organizations who have seized on this fortuity of the ravages of time to paint a picture of the whiteness of the Western inherited conglomerate, which is as far from the truth as it could possibly be. It all comes from much further east, and we all here sitting today know that. And so it's bad enough that they're just giving people a false idea about what antiquity looked like, but the notion that they are perpetuating a false idea that the most reviled organizations in the modern history of man have relied upon in supporting their racist views is really reprehensible.
You know, you gave a very powerful example of the replication of the arch from Palmyra and the attachment of many Syrian people to the replica in lieu of the destroyed original. I'm just wondering, given potential momentum in London right now for repatriation, let's just say that the British Museum did acquire, accession some of your replicas and exhibited them in place of the originals. Do you think that the British public could attach themselves to these replicas, maybe not in the same way that might be happening in Syria, but is there potential for British pride in repatriation and the attachment to to these very high quality replicas?
I mean, absolutely. Our experience with the Palmyra Arch has told us that that's not possible. It seems almost inevitable. And the spirit behind this project, the spirit that would necessarily be inherent to the gesture the British would make in returning these objects. And the sad truth is, this can happen in two ways. Either, I don't know if it's going to be Matt Bogdanos from the New York DA's office, or it's going to be Interpol, but somebody's going to drag those things out of there someday, and it's going to be shame on the British. They can do it now with grace, and they can do it now with a gesture of goodwill, and those replacement objects can become a source of pride for the British for having done something that I think everybody can respect. Or it could become a reminder of a sad time in Britain when they couldn't move forward with the rest of the human beings that occupy this planet and do the right thing. So I think absolutely they can and will be, I hope, exactly what you described. They will become monuments to British generosity, monuments to Britain moving into the 21st century, just as the Arch became a monument to the global outpouring of friendship and support that was focused on Syria during those dark days.
I want to just push you a little bit more on that because, of course, these works have very emotional significance, very symbolic significance in Britain as symbols of an elite culture, symbols of elite education, relics of a colonial past. And while public opinion is moving, we had a very strong statement from the British PM just a few days ago stating just the opposite, that they should stay in the British Museum. So my question is, what more? What other arguments need to be made? Or do you think that the wave of public opinion is enough to secure their return?
Is Ms. Truss still prime minister? You have to check CNN every 15 or 20 minutes to keep track of that. But I wouldn't pay too much attention to what she says. I don't think anybody does in Britain, especially in the parliament. But what I will say is that it's clear now that the British Museum trustees have the authority to do this unilaterally. And when you look at who's on that board, George Osborne is the chairman. This is a guy who rightfully, like anyone should be, is concerned about legacy. And he's not the kind of guy who I think wants to be the last person to have his claws into these objects. He wants to be the guy who does the right thing. You look at people like Abhijit Banerjee at MIT, Nobel Peace Prize winner, a guy who's spent his life supporting disadvantaged populations, working on behalf of the underdog. This is not a comfortable spot for him, and it's not comfortable, especially because the Cambodian objects are wrapped up in this too, and he spent, through JPAL, Poverty Action Lab, years working in Cambodia. Believe me, he's telling George, do something and do it quick. You look at Mary Beer, you look at Grayson Perry. These are people who I think do not want to be on the wrong side of history. And so I think that there's just no question that this can and will happen. I don't think it's going to require Ms. Truss, if she's still prime minister or not, to do a goddamn thing. I think that the trustees acting either under Section 5 of the British Museum Act of 1963 or the newly revised regulations by the Charity Commission, which allows them to deviate from trust requirements that impose a moral obligation that is somehow repugnant to public policy under either rubric. They've got the authority to do this, and I think they will. George has basically said, let's get it done. I think the only question now is what timing is going to be best for the Greeks and what timing is going to be best for the British.
Well, that's heartening to hear. I'm so glad to hear that you believe that there's so much momentum right now internationally and within the UK and possibly with the new king as well, potentially in support of this.
Well, I mean, they have become a pariah state. Like I said, I mean, you look around, I mean, the Cambodian objects alone, these were taken in the context of a 2 million person genocide. They were purchased in some cases in the late 90s, early 2000s when the provenance was well known. They're relying on the 1971 rule. The 1971 rule does not give you carte blanche to acquire objects that were looted before that time. And that's not what the protocol says in any way, shape, or form. And it certainly doesn't in any way affect your legal liability. So, you know, the British Museum needs to think about what it does, what it says, and how it reflects on the country that it represents. It's called the British Museum, and all British people have to take ownership of it. But the reality is that 80% number is a real number. We are at pains to find people that we encounter in our daily lives that don't support our work, that are in favor of repatriation. I'm not sure, apart from Ms. Truss, apparently, I'm not sure. I will say this, thanks to Sharon, Ms. Truss is now the only person in Britain that I know who's communicated directly that they don't want the marbles to go back, because everybody else we talk to has a different view.
Okay, and I guess one last question for me anyway. I just have to ask this because it probably in some people's minds, possibly in the audience, should it happen, would this open a floodgate? Would there be a domino effect for everyone for asking everything back from the British Museum and the other universal museums, the Met, the Louvre, and so on? How do you respond to that?
Well, number one, if you march into somebody's country and steal something and then put it on public display in a museum, you shouldn't be surprised if some number of decades, years, centuries later, they come along and say, hey, you stole this from me, I'd like it back. That's just the way the modern world works. So I don't feel bad for anybody who has to give back stuff that they've stolen, and I don't believe that the mere passage of time absolves them of the responsibility in that regard. The second thing I'll say is this is like the old saw about the Jack Kerouac, everybody flushing their toilet in Greenwich Village at the same time. It never happened. It's never going to happen. The truth is that there are many museums in the United States very eager to disgorge contested or potentially controversial objects, and they can't find people to give them back to. It imposes a financial burden, a practical burden. People are not clamoring for objects back. And in this particular case, the Greeks, for example, are offering objects in exchange for the marbles that are of vastly higher quality than the objects that the British Museum currently has. It will be an enormous net gain in terms of what the public comes to the British Museum and sees in those galleries if they make the swap with the Greeks. I think the Greeks have been way more generous than they need to be. I'm not sure how much of this is meant for public consumption, but all I can say is some of the great treasures of the Acropolis Museum are on offer as an exchange for the marbles. I don't believe the floodgates are going to open. In any case, the British Museum is currently showing less than 1% of 1% of the objects in their massive warehouses. So I don't think they're going to be hurting anytime soon. And I'll say this, if they do have some empty plinths, maybe it's time to put something British in the British Museum. You go into the Smithsonian, you see the Spirit of St. Louis, and you see Marilyn Monroe's dress, and you see the lunar module. And I think, hey, that's pretty cool. We went to the moon. The British should be able to go into their British Museum and see things that are British and that they too can feel proud of. And I think they should be able to feel proud of the institution too. And currently they can't do either.
Wow, I have many more questions, but Sharon, do you have one more, or?
I feel like I've been overwhelmed by Roger's passion, but something I think would be great for the audience to hear would be, what is the IDA's future work, and where will we next see you featured in a New York Times article?
Well, that's the strange thing. You know, we've had the very great good fortune to have a great public response to a couple of our projects, a few of our projects. We had a marine archaeology project last year that also had a similar kind of treatment. But the reality is that we do dozens of things all the time. We're doing a great project in Westminster Abbey at the moment that I think is going to be amazing when it's complete. No one hears about these things. We do all kinds of work on manuscripts. We do an amazing thing with the Menander palimpsest. I mean, so we do lots of things all the time. They're all documented on our website under the rubric of other projects. Take a peek. It is a strange phenomenon for us because we are known very widely for a very small number, maybe less than 1% of the projects that we do, but that is what most people think of when they think of us. I do think that we will be doing more in the way of virtual museum projects in the future. With this virtual museum concept is, I think, a very powerful one. Will allow museums in the big museums in rich countries to go places that they've never been before, and will provide opportunities for museums in small countries to do extraordinary things in their home countries. So I think that's a space that we would very much like to work harder and better in, and I think that's going to be our goal.
Well, Roger, thank you. This has been a really stimulating lecture and discussion. And congratulations on all of your technical work, your philosophical work, your political work. As I said at the beginning, you are working on many fronts. Sharon, I'd like to thank you as well and the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for co-hosting this event, along with the Greek Consulate General of Los Angeles for their support as well. And I also want to thank all of those of you in the audience who've provided financial support for our program and this distinguished lecture series. Your support allows us to create programming like this and provide opportunities for our students who are engaged in researching critical issues like this in cultural heritage conservation. And as a reminder to everyone, a recording of this lecture will be posted on our website. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much.